In the 1970s and 1980s, laughter echoed around the world every time the tune Yakety Sax began to play, and Benny Hill launched into his wild, chaotic chases on The Benny Hill Show. But suddenly, the show disappeared after a single sketch that lasted only a few minutes. It didn't make people laugh, it made them angry. That wave of outrage would soon drive a genius toward tragedy. What really happened behind that harmless scene? Stay with us, because you're about to see how one joke destroyed an empire and revealed something far darker about the world of fame itself. In the golden age of television, few faces were as recognizable as Benny Hill's. During the 1970s and 1980s, The Benny Hill Show was broadcast in more than 140 countries, turning a simple British comedian into one of the most famous entertainers on Earth. Each week, over 350 million people tuned in to watch his fast chases, silly gags, and playful jokes set to the famous tune Yakety Sax. The music became so iconic that even news reports, commercials, and sports highlights copied it. For millions of families, laughter started the moment Benny Hill appeared on screen. No subtitles were needed. His humor spoke a universal language of gestures, timing, and rhythm. People from Japan to South America understood it instantly, proving that laughter really could cross borders. Yet behind the cheerful scenes was something bigger than entertainment. Hill had built a bridge between the silent comedies of Charlie Chaplin and the television age. He took the physical humor that once lived in black and white films and gave it new life in color, speed, and music. Every sketch was planned like a dance, where expression mattered more than dialogue. It was this mix of movement and mischief that made him different from every other comedian of his time. By the late 1970s, Hill was more than a star. He was a cultural phenomenon. His face appeared on posters, lunchboxes, and late-night reruns. In Britain, his show reached 21 million viewers per episode, nearly half of the population. In America, public television promoted him as the British King of Comedy. Even celebrities like Michael Jackson, Anthony Hopkins, and Burt Reynolds praised his work, calling it pure and timeless. At his peak, Hill received the prestigious Rose d'Or Award and was nominated twice for an Emmy, achievements that confirmed his worldwide success. He had done something few comedians ever achieved: make people laugh without saying much at all. But success always carries a shadow. As the world laughed louder, something subtle began to change in the background. Society was shifting, and the kind of comedy that once united millions was starting to divide them. People began asking new questions about what humor should be and where the line should be drawn. For years, Benny Hill had been the man who made the world laugh, but soon that laughter would turn into debate, then into outrage. One sketch, meant to be a harmless parody, would break the very bond he had spent a lifetime building. It would transform him from a beloved entertainer into a symbol of a time the world no longer wanted to remember. So how did a man who made laughter his only religion end up accused of ruining it? That story begins with his childhood and the long road that turned Alfred Hill into the legendary Benny Hill. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton in 1924 into a modest working-class family far from show business. His father ran a small shop that sold surgical tools, while his mother managed the home and cared for the children. From an early age, Alfred was quiet and observant, fascinated by the way people acted when they thought no one was watching. Before he ever dreamed of performing, he lived a simple life filled with ordinary jobs. He worked as a milkman, a truck driver, a store clerk at Woolworths, and even a drummer in a local band. Each job taught him something about people, how they smiled to hide frustration, how humor could ease tension, and how laughter could make hard work bearable. He later said he learned comedy not from books or teachers, but from watching life go by. When World War II began, Alfred joined the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. He spent long nights repairing vehicles under the roar of bombers, learning patience and precision, but his real transformation came when he joined the Combined Services Entertainment Unit. There, he performed for soldiers exhausted by fear and loss, and for the first time, he saw how laughter could heal despair. He realized comedy wasn't just fun, it was survival. Those nights, he said, taught him timing, empathy, and the art of connection. After the war, he searched for a way to turn that discovery into a career. He looked to the great British music hall comedians who mixed slapstick and charm to lift audiences' spirits after years of darkness. But across the Atlantic, one man deeply influenced him, the American radio star Jack Benny. Jack's control of silence amazed Hill. He could make an audience laugh not by speaking, but by waiting. The pauses, rhythm, and expression became a kind of music. Inspired by him, Alfred took the stage name Benny Hill, both as tribute and as a statement of purpose. From that day, Benny Hill was not just a name but an identity, a character built on observation and perfect timing. Hill's humor blended the simplicity of everyday British life with the precision of American radio. He worked tirelessly, writing every script by hand and rehearsing each movement until it felt natural. Friends said he could repeat the same scene for hours, adjusting the rhythm between step and smile. By the early 1950s, he had developed a unique performance style, part mime, part satire, and entirely visual. Even Charlie Chaplin, the king of silent film, praised him in a personal letter, calling him the funniest man on British television. For Hill, that single line confirmed he was carrying the torch of comedy from one era to the next. He once told Radio Times, "I believe in only one religion, laughter." Every pause, every grin, and every look became his form of prayer. Benny Hill had found his voice without needing many words. But as his comedy blossomed, the world outside was changing fast. And soon, that change would come for him too. By the early 1950s, television was replacing theater and radio as the center of entertainment, and Benny Hill saw it as the perfect stage for his humor. Unlike most comedians who relied on dialogue, Hill believed pictures could speak louder than words. He wanted to revive the magic of silent film comedy with a modern twist, fast cuts, bright colors, and a rhythm that matched the speed of the new television age. In 1955, The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC, and it wasn't just another comedy series. It was a revolution in how laughter could look and sound. Hill wrote, directed, and performed most of the sketches himself, mixing parody, satire, and music into a whirlwind of chaos. Each episode felt like a miniature world, where policemen, pop stars, and shopkeepers all collided in absurd situations. Audiences loved it instantly. They laughed not at the words, but at the movement, the exaggerated expressions, the impossible timing, and the rhythm that carried every scene. His success proved that laughter needed no translation. Viewers from France to Japan and Australia understood his humor immediately. Even when they missed the words, they caught the rhythm, and that was enough. The chase sequences at the end of every episode soon became his signature. Set to the frantic tune Yakety Sax, the scenes showed Hill being chased by nurses, policemen, or glamorous women in fast motion. It was pure, joyful chaos, and somehow it felt universal. By 1969, Hill made a bold move, leaving the BBC for Thames Television, which offered him bigger budgets, color filming, and complete creative freedom. He began producing one-hour specials filled with elaborate storylines, musical performances, and clever visual effects. This change turned The Benny Hill Show into a worldwide phenomenon. By 1971, More than 21 million people in Britain, about 40% of the country, watched every episode. In the United States, PBS aired a shortened version that became one of its highest-rated comedies, second only to Fawlty Towers. Famous figures admired him. Michael Jackson called him a master of rhythm, while Anthony Hopkins described him as a genius who could make silence roar. Even Charlie Chaplin, near the end of his life, praised him as a true successor to the golden age of silent comedy. Hill had created humor that was universal, timeless, and wordless. A single raised eyebrow or a clumsy step could make millions laugh more than any clever line. He had taken the simplicity of vaudeville and given it the pulse of television. But behind the applause, comedy was beginning to change. As society grew more politically aware, audiences wanted sharper, more sophisticated humor. The mischief that once felt innocent began to seem outdated. The man who once made the world laugh was about to face a new world that no longer laughed with him. And it would all begin with one sketch, a scene that turned success into silence. What was in that moment that made people stop laughing? That is where Benny Hill's empire began to fall. It was 1987 when the sketch that changed everything finally aired. On paper, it was supposed to be funny, a light parody of a beauty pageant. But what appeared on television that night would become one of the most controversial moments in British comedy history. The scene began with a group of women walking across a stage in glittering costumes, smiling under bright studio lights. Benny Hill, playing the host, greeted them with exaggerated charm, throwing playful glances and comic gestures. The audience laughed, but this time the laughter didn't last. As the camera lingered too long on the contestants, the humor began to feel uncomfortable. The women didn't have lines, stories, or purpose beyond their appearance. They became props in a joke that no longer seemed innocent. What was meant to be a harmless spoof now looked like a reflection of something darker, how entertainment treated women as decoration rather than characters. When the credits rolled, viewers didn't smile. They wrote letters. The Independent Broadcasting Authority received more than 350 complaints in a single week, an unprecedented number for a comedy show. Major newspapers turned the sketch into a public debate. The Guardian called it television at its lowest point, while the Daily Mirror asked whether Benny Hill had finally crossed the line. It was a shocking turn for a comedian once celebrated for uniting people through laughter. What made this moment more tragic was how unintentional it was. Hill had created the scene as part of his usual slapstick style, meant to exaggerate human behavior. He didn't see it as offensive, he saw it as parody. When Thames Television suggested cutting the sequence where the camera panned up from the contestants' legs to their faces, he refused, believing that was where the joke lived. But times had changed, and the joke no longer fit the world around him. The mid-1980s were an age of growing awareness about gender and representation, and audiences were no longer laughing at the same things. The sketch became a mirror showing just how far culture had moved beyond Hill's humor. For the first time in his career, he faced not applause, but outrage. Yet even amid the criticism, there were voices of loyalty. Sue Upton and Louise English, two of the show's regular performers, defended him publicly, saying he was kind, respectful, and never inappropriate behind the scenes. They described him as a man from another time, someone who simply didn't realize the world had outgrown the kind of comedy he built. But public opinion rarely forgives what it sees as outdated. In the eyes of many, the beauty pageant sketch became more than a bad idea. It became a symbol of everything that was wrong with old television. The laughter that once made Hill a hero now made him look like a relic. The damage was done. Critics stopped asking whether the sketch was funny and started asking if it was acceptable. Within months, the debate surrounding Benny Hill became less about entertainment and more about morality. For a man who believed laughter was universal, it was a painful realization that even comedy could become a battlefield. But this was only the beginning of his fall from grace. The world that once adored Benny Hill was starting to move in a different direction. By the early 1980s, a new wave of comedians had arrived in Britain, bringing with them a very different kind of humor. They called it alternative comedy, and it was sharper, political, and openly critical of the establishment. While Hill's sketches were built on visual gags and wordless chaos, these younger comedians wanted to make people think rather than simply laugh. Names like Ben Elton, Rick Mayall, Don French, and Stephen Fry became the voices of a new generation that didn't just mock authority but questioned the culture itself. To them, Hill's world of slapstick and flirtatious humor belonged to a past that Britain needed to outgrow. Hill, who had once been seen as the symbol of British wit, suddenly became a target. Ben Elton, one of the leading figures of the movement, accused The Benny Hill Show of turning women into running jokes and said it encouraged a culture that viewed them as objects. His words hit hard, especially because they came during a time when feminism and social awareness were gaining strength across the country. Newspapers picked up Elton's comments and turned them into headlines. Some writers supported Hill, arguing that his comedy was innocent and universal, while others said it represented everything wrong with old television. The debate became bigger than the man himself. It was now a cultural battle between two visions of humor. The Independent wrote that Hill was not dangerous but simply a relic from another age. Meanwhile, Q magazine mocked Elton's outrage by comparing it to blaming pianists for poaching elephants, suggesting that linking Hill's humor to social harm was absurd. Yet no amount of defense could stop the shift that was happening. The younger audience, who once grew up watching Hill's fast-paced sketches, were now turning towards satire that challenged politics, class, and gender roles. Television executives started to worry that keeping Hill on air would make their networks look out of touch. In 1989, the Broadcasting Standards Council introduced stricter rules about how women and minorities were portrayed on television. They called for the removal of misogynistic representation from primetime shows, and The Benny Hill Show was suddenly at the center of the controversy. What had once been seen as harmless fun was now viewed through the lens of morality and progress. Hill was confused by it all. He had never intended to offend anyone, but the world no longer judged comedy by intent, it judged by impact. In an interview that year, he quietly asked, "When did laughter become something to fear?" It was a question that revealed how much the landscape of humor had changed. The old form of comedy, built on instinct and exaggeration, was being replaced by a more intellectual, self-aware form that demanded reflection and restraint. Hill, who once stood for the joy of simplicity, was now seen as a man trapped in his own time. The laughter that once united millions was dividing generations. And as the debate grew louder, one thing became clear. The television industry was preparing to close the curtain on the kind of comedy that had made him a legend. By the late 1980s, Benny Hill's empire was slowly falling apart. The laughter that had once united millions now echoed through half-empty studios, and ratings that once broke records began to fade each year. Younger audiences were turning away, looking for something new, something sharper. Hill's slapstick humor, once seen as brilliant and universal, now felt like a relic from another time. Even the network started to lose faith in him. Each episode of The Benny Hill Show cost nearly €450,000 to produce, a huge amount for that period. Sets, extras, elaborate dance routines, and location shoots all made it one of the most expensive comedies on British television. But the show was no longer pulling in the numbers to justify the cost. Executives at Thames Television quietly began discussing whether the legend had finally run its course. In 1989, after more than 2 decades on air, they made their decision. Without warning, Hill was told that his contract would not be renewed. He later said, "They didn't fire me. They retired me without asking." For a man whose entire life revolved around laughter, the silence was devastating. He didn't argue, he didn't protest. He simply packed up and left. To the public, it looked like the end of an era. To Hill, it felt like a personal defeat. But he refused to stop creating. 2 years later, he tried to reinvent himself with a new project called Benny Hill's World Tour. He planned to take his comedy abroad, filming in cities like New York and Paris, where fans still adored him. Only one episode, Greetings from New York, was ever completed. It featured familiar faces like Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton, but the spark that once defined him was missing. The show aired quietly and then disappeared. Behind the camera, his life had grown strangely small. Though he had earned millions, Hill never lived like a rich man. He rented a modest flat in Teddington, wore simple clothes, and preferred shopping for groceries himself because he liked the routine. He never married, never had children, and rarely appeared in public. Most evenings, he stayed home watching old tapes of his own show, sometimes laughing at the same jokes that once made the world roar. Friends described him as gentle, shy, and increasingly lonely. The deaths of his longtime colleagues Bob Todd and Jackie Wright hit him hard. They had been more than co-stars, they were his family. As his circle grew smaller, so did his health. By the early 1990s, Hill was suffering from obesity, high blood pressure, and heart problems. He was diagnosed with kidney failure after a minor heart attack, but he refused surgery, saying he wanted to live on his own terms. Doctors warned him he was running out of time, but he simply smiled and said, "I've had a good run." His decline was slow, quiet, and unseen by the world that once celebrated him. The man who once filled living rooms with laughter now sat alone in his own, surrounded only by the echo of applause from another lifetime. In April 1992, Benny Hill's quiet life came to an equally quiet end. He had been feeling weak for weeks, but he refused medical help, convinced he would recover on his own. Neighbors in Teddington noticed the lights in his small apartment stayed on day and night, yet no one saw him leave. On April 20th, police forced open the door and found him sitting in his armchair, the television still glowing. He had died of heart failure, alone at the age of 68. Ironically, that same day, a letter arrived from Central Independent Television offering him a chance to return to TV. The opportunity came too late. News of his death spread quickly, and tributes poured in from around the world. Fans left flowers outside the studio where the Benny Hill Show had once been filmed. To millions, he wasn't just a comedian. He was a piece of their youth, a reminder of simpler laughter. But his story didn't end there. Just months after his funeral, rumors began to spread that he had been buried with gold and cash. In November 1992, grave robbers broke into his tomb in Southampton, digging up his coffin in search of treasure. The police later confirmed there was nothing inside except Hill's remains and a few personal items. The grave was resealed with concrete to prevent further disturbance. It was a cruel twist for a man who had lived modestly despite his fame and wealth. Even in death, the myth surrounding Benny Hill refused to rest. In the years that followed, something unexpected happened. People who had once criticized him began to look back with new eyes. Younger comedians, including Ben Elton himself, admitted that Hill's work had shaped modern comedy more than anyone realized. He became recognized as the bridge between silent film legends like Charlie Chaplin and the television humor of the late 20th century. universities began studying his sketches to understand how physical comedy transcended language. Today, The Benny Hill Show still airs in more than 30 countries, long after his name faded from British primetime. Viewers now see it not as offensive, but as a time capsule of a culture that once laughed differently. Benny Hill's story remains both inspiring and tragic, a man who gave the world laughter yet couldn't escape being misunderstood by it. He believed comedy was timeless, but time itself proved to be his toughest critic. Still, his legacy endures in every wordless joke, every silent pause, every laugh that comes without explanation. Maybe Benny Hill didn't fail the world. Maybe the world simply forgot how to laugh like him. Benny Hill's story is a reminder that fame can fade as quickly as laughter. He built a world where humor crossed language and culture, yet the very jokes that once brought people together later drove them apart. His downfall was not caused by malice, but by the shift of a new era that no longer had room for his voice. In the end, Hill's legacy shows that comedy, like culture itself, never truly dies. It simply evolves with those who still love and understand it.